Let's get into some real science now and look at optical properties and radiative transfer. This is generally considered the toughest part of the optics session, so take your time and make note of any questions. It will help to watch the entire lecture series and then come back to this video again. Optical properties really just mean the characteristics of the environment and how they respond to different illumination conditions. Radiative transfer is simply the science of energy transfer in the form of electromagnetic radiation. In our case, the science of how light interacts with matter. Radiometry is the set of techniques for measuring electromagnetic wave radiation, including visible light. Radiometric variables are those quantities that can be measured. The most important of these is radiance. Radiance is, simply put, all the light arriving at a sensor from a certain direction, whether the sensor is in the water or on a satellite. The diagram on the top right shows a radiometer collecting light from a certain angular direction to arrive at a detector where it is filtered, diffused, and measured as an intensity of energy at each wavelength the detector is sensitive to. If you know the spectral character of the radiance, in other words its shape over the wavelength range of interest, you can compute all of the other optical quantities, so it's a very powerful measurement. The definition is the total quantity of photons emitted in a given area per unit time, per unit solid angle, per unit wavelength, per unit area. This quantity can be described for many different directions and positions: upwelling radiance, downwelling radiance, water-leaving radiance, and upwelling radiance just below the sea surface, as shown at the bottom right of the slide. Radiance is a vector. It always comes from a specific direction. On the other hand, irradiance is the light arriving at a sensor from all directions. There is no angular dependence of irradiance. It is a scalar quantity. It's one of the easiest optical measurements to make, and its units are simply power per unit area per wavelength. Here's the catch though, it's still directional. Upwelling irradiance is the light emitted upward from the ocean surface. It just doesn't come from a particular angle. Here's a reminder of some basic geometry showing the solid angle that you need for a measurement of radiance. You can think of radiance arriving to be measured at the center of a sphere from within the solid angle at the sphere's surface, whereas irradiance arrives from all over the sphere. Solid angles are measured in steradians, and many optical quantities in ocean color are measured per steradian, in other words, per solid angle. It's important to note that both radiance and irradiance change under different illumination conditions. Think about midday versus dusk. The light arriving at a sensor in the same place and position will be very different under these two different light fields. And these changes can be quite rapid, for example if clouds come over. But their ratio, the proportion of incoming versus outgoing light, is much more stable, and you'll see in a moment how this is useful. So now that we have some basic descriptors of the light field, let's look a little closer at what affects these measurements. We know that natural waters contain dissolved and particulate matter, and these are known as optically significant constituents because they impact upon the light field. The type and concentration of these constituents determine how light is scattered or absorbed. These are the inherent optical properties. These properties are inherent to the medium. They do not change in more or less light, or depending on the angle of observation. The scattering and absorption properties of in-water constituents are fixed according to what they are made of and how much there is of them. On the other hand, apparent optical properties depend on both the medium and the directional structure of the light field. We've looked at radiance and irradiance, which meet those criteria for apparent optical properties, but the fact is that they are just too variable to be all that useful. However, if you take their ratio, the proportion of incoming versus outgoing light, this quantity is stable enough to be a very useful descriptor of the light field. This ratio is used commonly in ocean color science and is known as the remote sensing reflectance, the fraction of downwelling irradiance, ED, that returns to the point of measurement as upwelling radiance, LW. Another useful apparent optical property is the diffuse attenuation coefficient, KD. This describes the loss of light within a medium as it is attenuated, either by absorption or by scattering. This is an important quantity in determining available light in the euphotic zone for biological applications. It can also be used to calculate the satellite penetration depth. Remember, a satellite only sees the surface, but sees the surface as the culmination of all the processes that happen underneath it. So in very turbid water it will not see very deep at all, but in clear water it will be seeing the influence of whatever is happening quite a long way down. This is called the optical depth, and is defined as the depth above which 90% of the irradiance arriving back at the sea surface originates. A large KD means there's a lot of attenuation and a small optical depth. A small KD signifies clearer water. The inherent optical properties of water and its constituents are much more inflexible. They vary, of course, but only according to the concentration and type of what's in the water. In other words, the IOPs for a grain of sand are the same whatever conditions you put the sand in, light or dark, in the lab or in the ocean. They are fixed physical properties and do not depend on the light field. There are two fundamental IOPs, the absorption coefficient A and the volume scattering function denoted by beta. Whereas absorption is scalar, representing simply the proportion of light at each wavelength that is absorbed, the volume scattering function describes the probability that light arriving at a certain incident angle will be bounced back at another certain angle. So it's the mathematical description of what you see in the schematic at the bottom of the slide. Incident light arrives in the medium and is scattered in all directions, but in different amounts. In the ocean, forward scattering is dominant, and this means that when the incident light is sunlight, much of it is lost to forward scattering, and this forms a large part of the attenuation. Backscatter is that light which is reflected back towards the sea surface, and this is a significant element of what we observe with satellite sensors. The scalar scattering coefficient B, analogous to the absorption coefficient, is simply the integration of all angular scattering. The radiative transfer equation is the mathematical way of relating the inherent optical properties to the apparent optical properties and vice versa. What this means is that we can use what we observe, the apparent optical properties, to deduce quantitative physical information about the inherent optical properties, which then tell us what we are looking at in the ecosystem in terms of what is in the water. The full equation is angular and depth dependent, but in essence you can see that it comprises two parts. As light travels through a medium along a certain path, its intensity is reduced by the medium's absorption properties, that's the negative term, reduced further by the bulk scattering properties, that's the second term, but then is augmented by scatter into the light's path, that's the complicated term with the integral over 4 pi, which represents a solid angle. In this way, we can mathematically, quantitatively, calculate either the light field, given the inherent optical properties, or the constituent properties, given the light field, by using the equation in either the backwards or forward direction. In the remote sensing context, we want to derive information about the particles in the water from the light field as observed by the satellite. So we approach the solution as an inverse radiative transfer calculation. First, we use a reflectance inversion algorithm to get the IOPs from the AOPs, and then we can use optical models of particles to retrieve their biogeochemical properties. In the lecture on research questions, we will look at an example of such a model to illustrate this further. Here is a more detailed look at what this process can look like and the types of information that are needed to perform these calculations. Starting with the IOPs this time, you need to define a set of boundary conditions, things like the sky radiance, or whether there's any reflectance from the bottom of the ocean. This all goes into the radiative transfer equation, from which the radiometric variables can be retrieved, radiances and irradiances, in any given direction. Given the complexity of the radiative transfer equation, it is used in many simplified forms as deemed appropriate for a set of given conditions. One commonly used approximation is that of reflectance. The reflectance approximation links the IOPs to the AOPs derived from satellite measurements. This approximation is necessary because satellites can't measure the directional distribution of the marine light field, and so assumptions are introduced into the radiative transfer solution. More exact solutions, like the hydrolyte software, are computationally very expensive and not used operationally, although they are useful for research purposes and algorithm development. The approximation shown here, that reflectance can be represented by a shape factor f over q in combination with the absorption and backscattering coefficients of the medium, is at the heart of most inversion algorithms using satellite radiometry to characterize in-water IOPs. IOPs are additive, which means that the bulk IOPs of a complex water body and all its constituents can be portioned into the respective contributions of each optically significant constituent. These characteristics are generally parameterized through models or by empirical observations. It should be remembered that there are regional and seasonal variations in constituent IOPs, and the scale of application of any validation dataset needs to be considered. So looking again at the reflectance approximation, we can see that the calculation can either be performed using the total or bulk IOPs of the medium and its constituents, or that they can be apportioned into their individual contributions. Immersing yourself in radiative transfer can be a bit of a shock to the system, but in its essence it's a simple concept. Light reduces in intensity as it travels through a medium. The amount by which it is reduced depends on the absorbing and scattering properties of the medium. And if you have enough information about these properties, the amount by which it is reduced can